All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking exactly how right-wing media frames modern democratic socialism. And to do this, we're using a really highly charged Fox News segment featuring Stephen Miller as our primary case study. Now, as focused learners, we know that understanding political rhetoric isn't about agreeing or disagreeing, it's about deconstructing how these arguments are built, how the narratives are structured, and why they resonate so deeply with their intended audience. So let's take a close look at the architecture of this very specific argument.
To keep us perfectly focused on the mechanics of this, here is our roadmap for today. 1. The midterm sprint. 2. Redefining democratic socialism. 3. Labor versus tribal grievances. And 4. The zero-sum political game.
So, let's kick things off with Section 1, the midterm sprint, setting the stage.
The broadcast immediately establishes this intense sense of urgency. They point out there are just 74 days to go until the midterm elections. Host Will Cain anchors this by discussing J.D. Vance campaigning at a steel plant in his hometown of Middletown, Ohio, literally the exact place his grandfather worked for 4 decades. This setting is incredibly intentional. It totally grounds the upcoming political theory in working-class industrial American imagery. Vance frames the upcoming election as a definitive binary choice. Do we believe in America or do we believe in nothing?
What's really fascinating here is how Vance sets the table for the interview. He's not just saying, hey, I disagree with incoming Democrats. No, he attributes incredibly extreme positions to them. He claims that if these quote-unquote radicals take control, they'll pass the craziest agenda America has ever seen, specifically alleging they want to abolish prisons, police, and borders. This rhetorical device is powerful because it immediately raises the stakes from a standard policy disagreement to a perceived fundamental threat to national stability.
Host Will Cain then transitions back to the studio. He brings up this list of actual policy wish lists you often hear associated with socialist candidates, stuff like Medicare for all, public-run grocery stores, free buses, even a soda machine in the Commons. Cain rightly points out that progressive commentators often look at this list and say, well, that sounds great. What's so scary about that? This direct question acts as the perfect springboard, prompting guest Stephen Miller to explain exactly why this specific list of policies is viewed not as a societal benefit, but as a severe threat by conservatives.
Which brings us to Section 2, redefining democratic socialism. Miller immediately pivots. When he's asked about those seemingly harmless policies, like the free buses, he argues that conservatives are actually making a fundamental mistake when dealing with modern socialists. He claims the left isn't engaging in a rational, good-faith conversation about the distribution of assets. Instead, he insists, the focus has to be entirely on the directional flow of that wealth. Who is it being taken from, and who is receiving it? And this really illustrates his core argument perfectly. Think about a traditional economic debate, right? There's this foundational good-faith assumption that everyone basically wants what's best for the country. The whole "a rising tide lifts all boats" idea. It assumes a shared affection for the American middle class. But Miller's claimed reality is completely different. He argues that modern socialists absolutely do not want everyone's boat to rise equally. According to his framing, their intent is to intentionally take physical and economic security away from the American middle class, the generations who sweat, toiled, and fought in wars, in order to give it to completely new groups.
To anchor this pretty abstract ideological claim into something tangible for the viewer, Miller throws out a very specific metric. He cites that half of the kids in New York public schools can't speak English properly, attributing this to his claim that 40% of New York State school students are either migrants or the children of migrants. By using this statistic, he's arguing that physical, local resources, like the public education system, are being actively redistributed away from the traditional local tax-paying base and handed directly over to newcomers.
So this all culminates in a radical redefinition of democratic socialism. Miller formally defines it not as a genuine economic theory driven by Karl Marx, but as an intellectual mask. He describes it as a cover for a hostile coalition, a mix of radical leftists, Islamists, and democratic socialists, who, in his words, are united by a hatred of the West. In this rhetorical framework, the economic policies are really just a disguise for a larger cultural and punitive dismantling of Western security.
All right, let's move on to Section 3, labor versus tribal grievances.
Host Will Cain steps in here to clarify things, and it creates a really fascinating contrast. Cain acknowledges that capitalism naturally produces inequality, sure, but argues that it's sorted through merit. Contrast this with original Marxism, which historically framed inequality as this massive struggle between the labor class and the capitalist class. But Cain points out that Miller is describing an entirely different framework here.
In this modern interpretation, wealth and spoils aren't distributed by class at all, but strictly along what they call tribal boundaries.
To back up this tribal distribution theory, Miller rattles off some very specific examples of groups that he claims are being systematically prioritized over traditional Americans. He points to Somali refugees in Minnesota, the policies emerging from the Black Lives Matter and George Floyd era, beneficiaries of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in the workplace, and migrant students. Miller argues that these initiatives are explicitly clear about who is now being denied fair treatment and jobs in America, reinforcing his whole narrative of targeted redistribution.
Miller then scales this entire concept up from local schools and jobs to a massive global level. He points out that the United States makes up roughly 4% of the global population, yet it holds about 25% of the world's GDP and wealth. In Miller's framing, the ultimate goal of this tribal socialist movement isn't just about domestic equity. It's a fundamental view that America's massive share of global wealth absolutely must be redistributed to the rest of the world.
So you might be wondering, who is actually driving this according to the broadcast? Well, Miller outlines this two-pronged coalition. On one side, you have what he calls the amoral calculators, traditional politicians like Chuck Schumer and Sherrod Brown, who he claims make cold-blooded electoral calculations, like supporting open borders or foreign labor just for political gain. And on the other side, you have the tribal groups themselves, represented by politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Miller argues that while this might not look like a logical political coalition on the surface, they're deeply united in one specific goal: taking wealth and resources away from the descendants of the American founders.
And that leads us right into our final section, Section 4, the zero-sum political game. Miller wraps up his argument with this incredibly stark statement. He notes that historically, what made the West, and America specifically, so unique was the idea of citizens voluntarily supplementing their own self-interests for the sake of their neighbors in a cooperative way. It wasn't an all-or-nothing game. But, he argues, because this traditional system has now been tribalized by the left, the political stakes have completely shifted. They've become entirely existential.
When a system gets tribalized like this, Miller argues that the opposing sides literally no longer share an ultimate goal or a shared end state for the country. And because there's no shared goal, he argues that you can no longer appeal to your political opponents using pure reason. Logic assumes you both want the same healthy outcome for the nation. Without that common ground, politics degrades into a purely binary conflict, a literal fight for survival.
As the segment wraps up, host Will Kane emphatically agrees. He states that this tribal fight over unique resources actually mirrors the tragic zero-sum dynamics we've seen historically play out and fail on the world stage. He frames America as a unique experiment that is currently buckling under the heavy weight of these tribal resource wars. It's a very heavy, highly dramatic conclusion to their discussion. Which leaves us with a really fascinating final question for you to chew on, and this is what you should really take away from this explainer. As a political observer, are we truly witnessing the end of cooperative politics in America, exactly as Miller and Kane suggest? Or are we simply witnessing the construction of a brilliantly calculated, highly potent narrative framework, a rhetorical tool designed specifically to mobilize voters by framing the opposition as an existential threat? Understanding exactly how these narratives are built is the absolute first step to truly grasping the modern political landscape.